Welcome to Unholy Inquiry, where each tale leads you deeper into a labyrinth of mystery waiting to be uncovered. This time, join us as we delve into Hercule Poirot and Everyone Saw Him Die, a fan-crafted story that pays homage to the genius and sophistication of Agatha Christie's iconic detective, Hercule Poirot. We are thrilled to have you with us on this captivating journey. Share your thoughts, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you spot any details we missed, your feedback is invaluable. Together, let's continue to shape even more thrilling enigmas. Chapter 1. The Man Who Died Twice. The scream came at exactly 10:47 p.m., sharp, slicing, unnatural. It didn't rise from the throat of a woman, but from the lungs of a man who did not believe he could be afraid. And by the time the guests reached the billiard room, Alistair Winthrop was very much dead. Again, the chandelier above his body swung gently, a single crystal teardrop falling and shattering on the marbled floor. A faint scent of cigar smoke clung to the velvet drapes, mingling with something more acrid. Burned paper, perhaps. His mouth hung open, eyes wide, frozen in a stare so direct it made the inspector flinch. And there, beside him, torn in half but unmistakable, lay a newspaper headline from 6 months prior. Alistair Winthrop declared dead in French Alps tragedy. Ah, mais oui, thought Hercule Poirot, lifting the paper gingerly with his gloved hand. The dead man had already been mourned, eulogized, and even buried. Yet here he was again, bullet in his chest, brandy glass in his hand, and the wrong shoes on his feet. That cannot be ignored, Poirot murmured softly. The shoes are size 10. Monsieur Winthrop, in life, wore a size 8.5. The vanity of English men. Always they insist on fashion over fit. The house was an ancient beast nestled on the Dorset coast, caught between ivy and sea. Storm clouds clawed at its roof as if to pry loose a
secret. Inside, the estate echoed with whispers. The guests, 7 in total, were locked in by order of the inspector. But it was not Inspector Larkham who truly investigated that night. No, it was Poirot who moved like a slow, deliberate storm through the drawing rooms and corridors, asking what seemed to be the most irrelevant questions, always watching. "There is something here," he muttered to himself. "Something unclean beneath the polish." Lady Winthrop, draped in grief and too much perfume, collapsed theatrically into an armchair. Her hands trembled just enough to be convincing. "You don't understand," she whispered to Poirot. "I saw him die. 6 months ago, I saw the avalanche bury him. His hand was outstretched. He said my name, and then he was gone." "You saw a hand," Poirot replied gently. "But did you see the face?" Her mascara bled into the fine creases around her eyes. She did not answer. The others hovered like shadows. Sir Rowley Barnes, Winthrop's oldest friend and executor of the estate, stood silent near the fireplace, sipping a drink he hadn't tasted. His military frame stiffened each time Poirot glanced his way. He had not moved to comfort the widow. Curious. Then there was Celeste Duval, the French secretary with a quiet voice and storm-colored eyes. Her presence was a whisper too loud, her silence carefully selected. She wore black velvet, but no tears, and she kept glancing at the billiard table, as if something had been there earlier, something now gone. And finally, young James Arkwright, the nephew. A wastrel, they said, a gambler, always in debt. He stood at the window, fingers twitching against the curtain, like he wanted to flee but couldn't find the door. Poirot moved from person to person as if orchestrating a dance. A question here, a pause there. He watched how people breathed, not just how they lied. "Tell me," he asked Sir Rowley, "when last did you see Monsieur Winthrop alive?" "This afternoon, around 2, in the study." He seemed nervous. "Nervous?" About what? I don't know. He dismissed me rather curtly. Poirot smiled. Ah, but you are a man who is rarely dismissed. How interesting. The study yielded its own secrets. Poirot examined the fireplace first. No ash. No fire had been lit, yet the poker had soot on it. Recently used elsewhere? Or perhaps for something not involving flames? Then the desk drawer. Locked. Poirot frowned, knelt, and opened his little case of tools. Inside was a thin sliver of brass, a lockpick disguised as a fountain pen. Sometime, he said, justice must borrow the tools of the criminal. Inside the drawer, he found the original telegram from Switzerland. Body of Alistair Winthrop recovered. No identification. Presumed drowned. A photograph was paperclipped to it. Poirot stared at the body on the stretcher, face bloated and unrecognizable. Then at the signature. Below the report, Dr. Émile Cordier, Geneva Forensics. Non, Poirot whispered. Not Geneva. Lausanne. A small detail, but a real doctor would never confuse the two. Later that night, Celeste cornered Poirot in the hall. Her voice was low and urgent. You must understand, she said. Alistair begged me to keep his secret. He came back 3 weeks ago. Told me someone wanted him dead. He faked the avalanche, hid in Paris, but someone followed him. I think, she gasped, clutching her stomach. Poirot caught her as she fell. Within moments, the household erupted again. Larcombe fumbled over the carpet. Poisoned, he barked. Tea? Wine? Poirot crouched over her. Her lips were blue. No, her hands. The fingertips. Ink-stained. She wrote something. Just before. And there it was. Beneath the folds of her skirt, slipped into her boot, a matchbox from Le Hibou Noir, a Parisian café. Inside, a single earring. Male. Ruby inlay. Poirot closed his eyes. Mon Dieu, he breathed. That was not Celeste's message. That was the killer's. Act by act, the drama intensified. In the library, Poirot laid it all bare. The man in the Alps was not Monsieur Winthrop. It was his valet. Switched clothes. An avalanche cannot question a corpse. But Monsieur Winthrop, he saw an opportunity to disappear. Why? Because he learned something. Something about his own fortune, yes? All eyes turned to James, who went pale. No, Poirot said calmly. Not him. He turned to Sir Raleigh. You were the executor. You who invested poorly. You who forged documents. Winthrop found out, yes? He threatened exposure. You let him vanish. But then, when he came back, you killed him, with the very pistol he left behind in the safe. Raleigh's glass slipped from his fingers. No one can prove that. Poirot nodded once. I do not need to. The matchbox Celeste held, it came from the same café you visited in Paris. I have already wired the French police. They have surveillance and fingerprints. You followed him across the sea. Sir Raleigh lunged, then collapsed. Inside his coat was a note, a confession, half-written. But Poirot did not look satisfied. He walked slowly to the window, staring at the wind-churned sea. He was not innocent, Poirot said at last. Monsieur Winthrop, he staged his own death, allowed a loyal servant to be buried in his name, for money, for escape, and poor Mademoiselle Celeste, used by both men. She died trying to tell the truth. The room was silent. The storm outside had finally passed, and Poirot, adjusting his cuffs, said quietly, It is a terrible thing, Hastings, when the dead return, but worse still is when they never truly leave. Behind him, the billiard table light flickered. Twice, then went dark. Chapter 2, Her alibi was too perfect. The typewriter still clicked, even though no fingers touched it. One key, just one, kept striking over and over. The letter G. It echoed in the empty study like a ticking bomb, relentless and unnatural. By the time Inspector Jarrow kicked in the locked door, the keys had stopped. But the body of Ernest Gainsley was already slumped over the desk, blood seeping through the cracks between the wooden boards. his mouth frozen in mid-word, and the smell of ink, metal, and something burned hung in the air like a cruel joke. Hercule Poirot arrived precisely 17 minutes later. The storm had delayed the coastal train, but not his mind. His eyes narrowed not at the corpse, but at the window. A faint trail of condensation curled in a shape that did not belong to nature. Someone had leaned there, recently and nervously. "Madame Gainsley is in the solarium," the inspector said. "Says she was listening to Brahms with a... Guess, not a single one places her anywhere near this room." "Ah," Poirot murmured, straightening his tie. "Then of course we must begin with her. A woman whose innocence is unanimously declared is either very loved or very dangerous." Evelyn Gainsley was calm, too calm. She wore a velvet burgundy gown with no wrinkles, no dust, no tears. Her voice was like glass, clear, cold, and prone to cracking under the right light. "I adored Ernest," she said. "He was a complicated man, but loyal. We had our routines, Monsieur Poirot. Tea at 5, Chopin at dusk, letters before bed. We had nothing to hide." Poirot tilted his head. "You say this with certainty, madame. But it is a curious thing, no? That the man with nothing to hide was found dead, while the woman with the perfect evening alibi has, too many witnesses." She blinked once. A smile flickered. "Are you suggesting I arrange for people to lie for me?" Poirot leaned closer, examining a speck of dust on her sleeve that he knew had not come from the polished solarium. "I suggest, madam, that sometimes the greatest illusion is not what one hides, but what one ensures is seen." The guests, 7 in total, had gathered at Larkspur Manor for the Gainsleys' annual autumn salon, a weekend of literature, wine, and whispered egos. Among them, Professor Halvers, a historian with a weakness for younger women and older brandy; Violet Markham, Ernest's business partner, sharp-tongued and dressed in widow's black though her husband was very much alive; and Jonathan Fisk, a quiet, unassuming violinist with hands too gentle and eyes too calculating. Poirot observed them all at dinner. No one mentioned the murder, but everyone chose their words like knives. "I always said Ernest pushed too hard," Markham muttered over pheasant. "Some men never know when to retire." "Or whom to trust," added Professor Halvers, swirling his wine. Fisk said nothing, but Poirot noticed he ate nothing but the softest foods and used his left hand to cut his meat. The second act began with a match. A single matchbox from the Gainsleys' private study turned up in Fisk's coat pocket, monogrammed with a G, identical to the one found in Ernest's typewriter tray. It should have been damning. And for Jarrow it was. "That's our man," he said. "Case closed." "Non, mon ami," Poirot said softly. "It is far too early for closure. When something fits too well, it often fits no one at all." Poirot visited the study again that night. Rain licked the windows. The desk lamp was still on, the typewriter ominously still. He stood over the body and whispered, "What were you typing, monsieur, with death at your shoulder?" A carbon sheet had slipped behind the drawer. Poirot extracted it gently. A partial message remained. Only 4 letters, G-E-N. "Not Gainsley," he murmured, "but perhaps Gentry? A name, a place, or a code?" The clue seemed meaningless until Poirot questioned Violet Markham again. She flinched when she saw the paper. "Where did you find that?" Poirot waited. Her pupils shrank. "It's nothing," she said too fast. "An old correspondence. From last year. Gentry was your maiden name, yes?" She paled. "Ernest was blackmailing me. He found out I falsified numbers in our early investment firm. Years ago. He kept a letter. I thought he'd destroy it, but he didn't. He wanted control. Over me. Over Evelyn." "Ah," Poirot whispered. "So the motive expands." Now Evelyn Gainsley was not the grieving widow of a beloved man, but a woman freed from a private torment. The perfect alibi, Poirot thought again, was too perfect because it was rehearsed, and rehearsed because she knew this day would come. But the twist, the twist. It came not from her, nor from Violet. It came from Jonathan Fisk. Poirot followed a thread that had been nagging him: Fisk's left-handed dining. Ernest. Gainsley had been shot in the right temple, but the gun had been found on the left side, and the fingerprints cleaned, wiped, too well. Only one set remained faintly on the trigger. Fisk's. I never meant to kill him, Fisk whispered when confronted. He wasn't supposed to be there. The gun was to scare him. Evelyn said he'd be in the garden. She said she'd make sure. Poirot's heart sank. Evelyn had manipulated not just a room of guests, but a fragile, desperate man who loved her in silence. She had promised him freedom and used his devotion as the weapon. The final act unfolded in the drawing room. Poirot stood in the center like a conductor at the edge of a tragic symphony. It is the nature of the criminal, he said, to confuse complexity with genius. But the truly clever crime hides in simplicity. He pointed to Evelyn. Your alibi was rehearsed. Each guest recalls a different piece of your performance. Your laughter, your silhouette, your perfume. But no one saw you the whole time. You made sure they each saw a fragment, so no one could say for sure where you weren't. She did not deny it, only raised her chin. Ernest destroyed everything I loved. I gave him 12 years. He gave me silence, cruelty, and surveillance. Poirot nodded. And so you found a man you could break just enough to kill for you? Fisk wept in the corner. Violet looked away. Halvers muttered something about Greek tragedy. The inspector arrested them both. Evelyn for conspiracy, Fisk for manslaughter. But Poirot sat in the study long after the others had left. The rain had stopped. The moon hung like a pale eye. He glanced at the typewriter, G-E-N, and whispered, genocide of the soul, perhaps. That is what happens when love becomes a cage. Then he stood and walked into the darkness, leaving the room quieter than any death could make it. Chapter 3. The blood vanished before dawn. The floor was wet with something dark when the maid found it, soaked into the rug beneath the grand staircase, glistening thick and coppery in the candlelight. She screamed, of course. Anyone would. But by the time Poirot arrived, just before the first glow of morning touched the east window, the blood had vanished, gone. No smears, no trail, no scent of iron, not a single stain to prove it had ever been there. And yet the maid swore, by the Holy Virgin, that it had soaked through the soles of her shoes. Poirot knelt, not where the blood had been, but on the marble step just above. He touched the banister lightly. It was warm, recently cleaned. He sniffed the air. Lavender polish. Too strong, too fresh. Someone had scrubbed this floor with religious devotion. A man may clean a stain, he whispered, but rarely the reason it appeared in the first place. The manor belonged to Sir Reginald Harwood, a former judge who, in his 72nd year, still ruled his family with the clipped precision of a gavel. He was not the sort to tolerate superstition or theatrics. And yet when Poirot entered the drawing room, he found the old man pacing, not like a man awaiting justice, but like one fleeing it. There was no murder, Reginald said firmly. No body, no weapon. This is nonsense. Poirot glanced at the fire. It burned too hot for such a mild autumn morning. And yet, mon cher, one does not wake to a pool of blood and simply call it a misunderstanding. Someone bled here. Someone tried to hide it. 3 guests were present that weekend, all with reasons to lie, all with alibis just slightly too rehearsed. First was Claudia Harwood, Reginald's estranged daughter. Once an acclaimed stage actress in Vienna, she had returned suddenly to the family home after 15 years abroad. She claimed it was to reconcile. Her father claimed it was to beg. Second, Lord Gregory Penwick, Reginald's longtime friend and business partner, who had been caught in multiple scandals over the years, but somehow always emerged clean. He arrived 2 nights earlier to settle a legal dispute, though no such document had been filed. Third, Dr. Felix Moreau, a French physician turned novelist whose most recent book, The Wounds That Lie, contained a story strikingly similar to a real case Reginald had once overseen, a case involving a man wrongly condemned, later found innocent after his execution. People lie, Reginald said bitterly. They invent ghosts when truth becomes inconvenient. Poirot's fingers trailed the edge of a table. Dustless, cleaned too recently, but only here, in this half of the room, as if the other side had been left untouched intentionally. A subtle division. He turned to the doctor. Tell me, monsieur, what do you think of blood that disappears? Moreau lit a cigarette. His hands trembled slightly. If it truly vanished, then perhaps it never existed. Or perhaps it was taken. Taken, Poirot repeated. Oui. By whom? By someone who had reason to make it vanish, he replied, or someone afraid of what it would reveal. Later, Poirot walked the grounds. The wind stirred leaves like whispers across gravel. He passed a shed that smelled of iron and damp wood. Inside, beneath a tarp, he found it. A stained sheet, not fully cleaned, not burned, folded neatly, hidden terribly. He brought it back to the manor without a word, laid it on the billiard table, and watched. Claudia froze. Her hand gripped her locket. Where did you get that? Poirot said nothing. Penwick took a step back. I've never seen it before. Again, Poirot was silent. Moreau reached for his cigarette case, but it wasn't in his pocket. Poirot held it up. You left it in the shed. Moreau's face hardened. Then arrest me, Poirot finally spoke. Non, monsieur. That would be premature. Guilt is a curious costume. Anyone can wear it. It is the fit that matters. They were all lying. That much was clear. But the truth was not a simple thread to tug. It was a web. The turning point came at midnight. Poirot sat in Reginald's study, beneath the oil portrait of the judge in his younger days. The fire hissed. The storm outside rose. And then Claudia entered, barefoot, holding an envelope. This was mailed to me last week, she whispered. I didn't show it to anyone because I didn't want it to be true. Poirot opened it. Inside, a photograph. Grainy. A man, bound, bruised, seated in a dim room. A date scrawled at the bottom. October 2nd. The man in the photo, Claudia said, is Marcus Bell. Poirot stilled. The man your father sentenced to hang in 1911. He didn't die, she said. He survived. Someone helped him escape. And now, someone brought him here. But why? Poirot asked. What would he want after all this? Time. Revenge, she whispered. It unraveled quickly after that. The shed. The blood. The note slipped under Poirot's door that read simply, He is not gone. He is beneath. Poirot summoned the household at dawn. The cellar door was locked, but beneath the floorboards, beneath the wine racks, they found the tunnel. Old, unused, collapsed in places. At its end, a man's body. Bound, face unrecognizable from rot. In his hand, a watch with Reginald Harwood's initials. It was Penwick, who cracked first. He confessed to bringing Bell back, years ago. He'd faked the execution, paid a doctor, hid Marcus in the countryside. For years, he kept him as leverage. But when Bell began to slip into madness, he became unpredictable. Penwick feared exposure, so he brought him here. One last time, he claimed, to settle it. Reginald had recognized him, had attacked him, had drawn blood. But it was Claudia who cleaned the floor. I didn't want anyone to know. She said that he came back, that he was real. I thought I'd imagined it. The second twist came in silence. Poirot turned slowly to Moreau. You did not write that book as fiction, did you? Moreau looked down. You were the doctor. In 1911, a long pause. Yes. You falsified the death certificate. I did it because it was the right thing. Bell was innocent. I knew it. But when he returned, he was no longer the man I saved. He was hungry for vengeance. I couldn't reason with him. And then Reginald, he provoked him. Poirot nodded. So you helped bury him. Again. The three stood before him, Penwick, Claudia, Moreau. Each had a hand in the resurrection. Each had a reason to erase the blood. And Poirot said quietly, "The tragedy, mes amis, is not that a man came back from the dead. It is that he came back to find the living still unchanged." The sun broke through the stained glass above the landing. The blood had vanished before dawn. But the guilt, the guilt, it stained everything. Poirot turned to leave. "Justice," he said softly, "has a strange sense of time. Sometimes it arrives not when called, but when it is most ashamed of being late." Chapter 4. A corpse that pointed. The fire had gone out long before the scream. Cold ash lay undisturbed on the hearth, yet the echo of that scream, sharp, breathless, clung to the walls like smoke. By the time Poirot stepped into the parlor at Thornley Manor, the air itself had stiffened into silence. In the center of the room, the corpse of Mr. Alton Reed lay on the floor, eyes open, mouth slack with a final unfinished word, and one arm rigidly extended, finger outstretched, pointing straight toward the grand piano in the corner. Not toward a person, not toward a weapon, toward an object no one had touched in months. "Hastings," Poirot murmured softly, though his companion was not present. "What an inconvenient thing it is. Death. Always it interrupts the performance. But this one insists upon an encore." He crouched beside the body, eyes flicking not to the wound. There was no visible wound, but to the unusual position of the limbs. The rigor mortis had set in fast, unnaturally fast, and the index finger, how curious. It rested not on the floor, but slightly lifted, as though, even in his final breath, the man had not collapsed but directed, accused, exposed. Poirot leaned closer. A slight smear of something dark clung to the underside of the nail. Not blood. Ink. Sir Harold Stratton, the owner of the estate, hovered in the doorway, a brandy glass untouched in his hand. No one heard a shot. No one saw anything. He was alone in this room for less than 10 minutes. Poirot rose slowly. "That, my dear Sir Harold, is precisely the problem. No one saw anything, and yet the dead man saw everything." The room was pristine. Books lined the shelves in perfect symmetry. No sign of struggle, no disarray, only the corpse, the piano, the pointing hand. Poirot turned to face the others as they entered one by one. Lady Stratton, pale and tight-lipped, her fingers nervously twisting her pearls. Miles Gresham, the family solicitor, stern-faced and quick to frown, and Isabel Kent, Sir Harold's niece, recently returned from Paris, draped in mourning black despite no relation to the deceased. "I had no quarrel with Mr. Reed," she said softly when asked. "He was a guest, polite, reserved, distant, but not silent," Poirot noted. "He was a pianist, was he not?" "Of course. He played before dinner every night," said Lady Stratton. "Chopin mostly. And yet he played nothing tonight," Poirot replied. "Why?" No one answered. Poirot walked to the piano, dusted keys, clean lid. Then he noticed it, a single key, C sharp, pressed down slightly, not fully, but not untouched. "Someone has opened this," he said quietly, drawing back the lid. Inside, wedged between the hammers, was a folded piece of paper. It read, "Do not trust the one who claps." Poirot folded the note delicately. How theatrical, and how tragic. A man dies, mid-performance, and yet the audience applauds none the wiser. Sir Harold bristled. "What are you implying?" Poirot smiled gently. "Nothing, monsieur. Yet." Act 2 began with contradictions. Poirot asked each guest to recount their whereabouts in the hour before Reed's death. Lady Stratton insisted she had been in the garden reading. Gresham had been in the study preparing a contract. Isabel claimed she had been alone in the greenhouse sketching. And Sir Harold? He said he was shaving before dinner. Curious, Poirot thought. 4 different rooms, 4 private alibis. and a dead man in the only room no one claimed to have visited. Poirot studied the glass Reed had been drinking from. Still a quarter full. He tasted the rim with the tip of his finger. Bitter, metallic, laced. Ink and poison, he whispered. A duet not often composed. Then came the first twist. The ink beneath Reed's nail was from a fountain pen found not in the room, but in Gresham's briefcase, left conveniently open on a side table. "Explain," Poirot said quietly. Gresham turned red. Reed was writing a confession. He'd asked me to draw up a will. He said someone here had blackmailed him years ago, threatened to expose something from his past. He never said who. And the will? Torn up. I burned it in a moment of panic. A curious choice, Poirot replied, to destroy the words of a dying man. But he wasn't dying when he wrote it. No, Poirot said. He was already dead in someone's mind. Poirot inspected the ink again. Not standard blue, but violet, rare, French. The same ink used in a letter he had seen earlier, on Isabel Kent's writing desk. She denied it. Everyone uses violet ink in Paris, but not in Thornley Manor, Poirot said softly. And the poison, belladonna. Not easily obtained, but found in abundance in your private garden. I didn't kill him, she snapped. I swear. Then came the second twist. Lady Stratton entered Poirot's room late that night. Her voice shook. He wasn't pointing at the piano, she said. He was pointing beyond it. To the mirror. He saw someone. He tried to tell us. Poirot nodded slowly. Merci, madame. That is what I needed to know. The final act was quiet. Poirot assembled the household at dawn. The mist outside wrapped the manor like gauze. The fire crackled once, then fell silent. Mr. Alton Reed did not die by violence. Poirot began. He died by deception. Poisoned not just in body but in spirit. He was a man tormented by truth. And truth, mes amis, is a most unforgiving assassin. He turned to Gresham. You gave him the poison. You disguised it in the ink. Knowing he would wet his pen with his finger, as he always did before playing. Gresham's face crumpled. He ruined my father. Lied in court. Cost him everything. I thought if he confessed, it would bring peace. Poirot turned to Isabel. You knew. You found the note. You tried to warn him. She nodded. And Lady Stratton, he said gently, you told me what he was really pointing at. Poirot walked to the mirror, clean, unblemished. But when he breathed on it, faintly, letters appeared. H.S. Sir Harold paled. You were the blackmailer, Poirot said. You found out about Reed's past. You threatened him with exposure. Gresham discovered it, took revenge. Sir Harold collapsed into the chair. I did it for money, he whispered. Reed had inherited a fortune he didn't deserve. I needed it to save the estate. You poisoned his soul, Poirot said coldly, and Gresham finished the work. Outside, the sun pierced the mist. Poirot stared at the piano. The final note still struck, still vibrating faintly in the quiet. A man may point in death, he said at last, not to accuse, but to beg. For truth, for dignity, for an ending worthy of the pain that preceded it. He turned and left the room in perfect silence. Chapter 5. The Widow Who Smiled Too Soon. The curtains in the morning room had not yet been drawn when they found him, slumped across the arm of the leather chair with one shoe missing and his wedding ring clenched between stiff fingers. The light that filtered through the frost-laced windows fell directly on his face, revealing a stillness far too complete. His mouth was slightly parted, not from a scream, but a breath cut short. And above all, what struck the maid dumb with fear wasn't the bloodless face or the unnatural silence. It was the smile of the widow watching from the far end of the corridor. Still in her nightdress, calm as moonlight, with no tears and a soft curl at the corner of her mouth, like she had expected this exact ending. When Poirot arrived at Marchmere Hall later that afternoon, The snow had begun to fall in earnest, blanketing the moors and muting every sound but the crunch of his boots. He did not ask where the body had been moved to. He did not ask who had called him. Instead, he looked up at the third-floor window where the widow stood now, watching again. Her hand lifted slowly in greeting. She wore black already, though the death had occurred just 12 hours ago. The veil was unnecessary but dramatic, the kind of drama only the guilty performed before the stage was built. Inside, the warmth of the fire could not thaw the chill that hung around the case. Lord Gregory Marrowby had been pronounced dead from cardiac arrest. No wounds, no struggle. And yet the coroner, a cautious man by nature, had hesitated. There were signs, an injection mark hidden under the sleeve, traces of an unprescribed sedative. The doctor was unsure. The inspector was hesitant. The widow, however, was not. He was a man of many vices, she said lightly. Eventually, one must expect a price to be paid. Poirot noted the words. Not mourned, not grieved, expected. Lady Isidora Marrowby was not the woman society papers painted her to be. Behind her porcelain features and delicate phrasing lay the cold precision of someone who had waited a long time for a particular morning. She'd met Gregory at a charity gala in Cairo. Poirot remembered it well. A swift marriage, a long silence. Then suddenly, invitations to reappear. And now, tragedy. Poirot sat in the library where Gregory had last been seen alive. The fire had been rebuilt since, but the faint scent of old tobacco and wool lingered. On the desk, neatly stacked, were drafts of a new will, unwitnessed, unsigned, and yet scrawled in Gregory's meticulous hand. He had intended to remove his wife as sole beneficiary. Ah, Poirot mused, smoothing his mustache. A man on the cusp of cutting ties is most often the man who is cut short. There were 3 other guests at the manor that evening, each one seemingly innocent, each one carefully poised. First, Colonel Basil Trent, a retired military man with a maillard face like carved granite and a limp that worsened only when watched. He claimed to have been playing billiards at the time of Gregory's death and had an alibi no one questioned. "We fought together in India," he said of the deceased. "If I'd wanted him dead, I would have done it years ago." Second, Miss Eliza Pettimore, Gregory's cousin and secretary, a woman with sharp eyes and a voice trained not to tremble. She kept the accounts, knew the codes to every safe, and guarded the family's reputation as though it were a dying patient in need of constant care. "Gregory had enemies," she whispered, "but none in this house." And third, young William Hargrove, the ward, barely 23, nervous, awkward, with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. He'd been adopted into the household after the death of his parents and treated as a son, though never quite accepted as an heir. "I was asleep," he told Poirot. I didn't know anything had happened until Lady Isidora screamed." "Ah, she screamed?" Poirot inquired gently. "And what sort of scream was it, monsieur? Of terror or of rehearsal?" The boy looked down, unsure. Poirot took a slow walk through the halls that evening. The wind rattled the windows. A grandfather clock clicked with eerie precision. He paused at the stairwell, studying the railing. It had been polished recently, too recently. One baluster bore a faint smudge of something oily, not the usual polish. Poirot leaned in. Belladonna, traces of it, a plant, a poison, untraceable unless you knew where to look. He followed that scent down to the cellar. There, tucked behind wine crates, he found a medical kit. Inside, syringes, gloves, and a vial marked with a surgeon's signature long faded. He returned to the drawing room, where Lady Isidora was sipping tea. She offered him none. "You were a nurse before you married," Poirot said calmly. "Briefly," she replied. "You administered morphine during the war." She smiled thinly. "It was a long time ago." "Indeed," Poirot nodded. "But skills such as yours, they do not wither. They wait." She said nothing. The twist came with a diary. Miss Pettimore produced it from her handbag with shaking fingers. "He gave this to me," she said, "just last week. Asked me to keep it in case something happened. I didn't read it until this morning." Inside were entries that charted Gregory's increasing suspicion of his wife, mentions of arguments, of financial discrepancies, of a growing fear that she was slipping things into his wine. But it was the final entry that broke the rhythm. A single line: "If I die, it will not be from nature. Look to the boy." Poirot reread it thrice. "The boy," he repeated. "But why?" It all snapped into place when he confronted William in the parlor. Poirot's voice was quiet, like footsteps on velvet. "You were not his son. Not truly, but he knew." William trembled. "You were his son from another woman, conceived before his marriage to Lady Isidora. A mistake he tried to bury." "I didn't kill him," the boy cried. I only wanted him to acknowledge me, to stop pretending I didn't exist." Poirot nodded slowly. "You confronted him." "That night, he refused. And then—" "He told me to leave," William whispered. "Said I'd never get a penny." "And Lady Isidora?" "She came after. I heard them arguing." Poirot looked back at the teacup. Still, untouched. Still steaming. "You did not kill him," Poirot said gently. "You broke him." But she finished it. He gathered them all in the salon as the snow thickened outside. "Lord Marrowby was murdered," Poirot began. "Not by rage, but by patience. Slowly. Over weeks. His body weakened. His mind dulled. And when the final dose was given, it was untraceable, because it had always been there." He turned to Lady Isidora. "You smiled too soon, madam. Before the grief, before the investigation, a smile not of mourning, but of relief." She stared at him. "You have no proof." "Only your hands," Poirot replied, stepping forward. "Clean. Too clean. Scrubbed raw. Not from nerves, but from guilt. And this," he held up a vial, identical to the one found below, "was replaced in your sewing kit. By your own maid. She saw you mix it, and she feared you. So she called me." The silence cracked like ice. Lady Isidora did not speak again. Her veil slipped as she was led away. No longer the smiling widow, only the actress at the final curtain. Poirot turned to the boy. "You have lost your father twice," he said softly. "But perhaps now you will find yourself." And as the fire dimmed in the hearth, Poirot stood alone. "A smile hasting," he murmured to no one. "It is a curious thing. On the lips of a murderer, it arrives not after the act, but before, a prophecy, a betrayal of the soul." And then, without another word, he stepped into the snow, letting the door close behind him like the end of a sentence long overdue. Chapter 6. Footprints that didn't belong. The snow had fallen silently through the night, blanketing the forested estate of Elderwick like a burial shroud. Every tree limb was etched in white lace. The world looked pure, untouched. But when the housemaid opened the rear veranda door just before dawn, she froze mid-step. A single trail of footprints led across the back lawn, deep and sharp in the fresh snow. The path came from the woods and stopped at the door. But here was the terror. The door had been locked from the inside all night, and no footprints led away. Hercule Poirot arrived at Elderwick Hall that morning, with the wind still thick with frost and tension so sharp it sliced the pleasantries in half. Inspector Felton met him with a face already red from confusion and embarrassment. "We've confirmed the prints," he said quickly. "Size 11, men's boots, unknown tread. No one in the household wears them. And Mr. Everett, he was found in the drawing room, dead. No sign of forced entry. No wounds. No struggle. And the room was locked from within." Poirot walked in silence toward the scene of the death. He did not ask about motive. He did not ask about family. He looked instead at the pattern of melted ice on the hardwood just inside the door, where faint traces of moisture lingered, without any snow remaining. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Ah," he murmured, "this is not snow. This is sweat." Inside the drawing room, Everett, Grange, wealthy shipping baron, twice widowed and recently engaged, sat as if merely dozing, chin tucked into his collar, a single hand draped limply across the arm of the velvet chair. His tea sat untouched. His spectacles rested neatly on the writing table. His face, however, wore the most peculiar expression, not pain nor surprise, but a curious detachment, as though the moment of death had come not from violence, but from surrender. Poirot's fingers hovered above the teacup, careful, not to touch. The rim was smeared with something faintly yellow, not sugar, not lemon, curcumin perhaps, or turmeric, something medicinal, or meant to appear as such. He glanced at the books beside the cup. One was open to a chapter on rare plant-based tonics, and beneath that, a handwritten note in Everett's precise hand. Must remember to speak with Lucien about the medicine. Too bitter. Poirot turned slowly toward the window, noting the fine layer of dust along the sill, untouched by wind. The window was locked from the inside. No signs of tampering, and yet, the footprints. 3 guests remained in the house that night, not counting the servants. Each had known Everett for years. Each claimed no knowledge of enemies. Each had something to lose. Lucien Carr was the estate's steward, a quiet man with sun-leathered skin and a distant gaze. He had managed the grounds for 2 decades. Loyal, efficient, invisible. But Poirot noticed how often he looked down, as if scanning the floor. I oversaw his diet, Lucien explained. Mr. Grange had developed an interest in Eastern remedies. He asked me to prepare a blend of herbs. Harmless stuff? Relaxants? Poirot smiled politely. And you are a man who values precision. Yes? The kind who leaves no print unless he wishes it? Lucien's brow furrowed. I don't understand. Non, monsieur, Poirot said gently, but you will. Then came Eleanor Bryce, Everett's soon-to-be, heart, especially after the heart has stopped. The final guest was Miss Katrina Wells, a botanist from Edinburgh, and an old friend of Everett's first wife. She had arrived 2 nights prior to advise him on a conservatory renovation, and yet had not once stepped into the greenhouse since her arrival. He was a good man, she said firmly. Troubled, yes, but decent. If someone poisoned him, it wasn't me. Of course not, Poirot said with a smile. After all, you did not even see the tea, n'est-ce pas? She blinked. No, I wasn't in the drawing room. I was asleep. Ah, but you see, Poirot said softly, sleep is a fascinating alibi. One must be either entirely alone or entirely honest to claim it convincingly. And you, mademoiselle, are neither. That evening, Poirot requested the boots of every guest be brought to him. He laid them out in the hallway like a detective of shadows. None matched the prints. Not exactly. Not even closely. But one. Pear, the stewards, had recently been scrubbed with vinegar and baking soda. An odd choice for leather. Poirot raised a brow. Cleaning boots with kitchen ingredients? Either you are frugal, monsieur, or you had something to hide. Lucien Carr swallowed. I stepped in something foul. I thought it best. Yes, Poirot waved his hand. You thought. Poirot walked the grounds alone the next morning. The trail of footprints remained intact, frozen now into the snow. They stopped, at the door. But one thing changed. A second trail had appeared overnight, faint, like something shifting beneath the ice. Poirot knelt beside the tree line and brushed away a thin layer of snow, revealing an iron hatch. A storm drain. Locked, or at least it had been. Inside, he found a passage leading beneath the estate, lined with brick and old lantern fixtures. Damp, forgotten, but usable. It opened directly beneath the drawing room fireplace. When he emerged, Poirot no longer wore the face of a man speculating. He had become the man who knows. He summoned them all into the parlor at twilight. The crime, he began, was not one of passion, nor of greed. It was one of design. A performance in 3 acts. The footprints, the tea, and the will. He turned to Katrina Wells. You brought the poison, not to kill him, but to test his sincerity. You believed Everett had betrayed his first wife. You hoped to scare him, make him confess. But the dose, it was too strong. Katrina turned white. No, I wanted him to be sick, not dead. Poirot turned to Eleanor. You found him. You saw the opportunity. You placed the note in his book, adjusted the will that lay unsigned in his drawer. You needed the inheritance to escape the debts your fiancé did not know about. Eleanor's eyes widened. You can't prove that. No, Poirot said softly. But I can prove this. He laid a single paper on the table. It bore a smudged fingerprint in turmeric-stained ink. It matched the letter Eleanor had written to her solicitor just days before, asking when the will would be finalized. She stared, silent, but Poirot was not finished. The trail of footprints was planted, a red herring, a tale of fear to distract. They were made with a pair of old boots kept in the cellar. Boots that belonged to a man long dead, Everett's first gardener. Lucian used them to create mystery. Why? Because he feared being blamed. Lucian shook his head. I did it to protect Miss Wells. She told me what she planned. I thought if I could distract the authorities by creating a ghost, Poirot finished. But ghosts do not kill. People do. There was silence. Then Katrina spoke quietly. I didn't mean to. I swear Poirot looked at her for a long moment. Intent is a thing only the soul may measure. The law, it must weigh the action. As the inspector led her away, Eleanor stood paralyzed, not guilty of the murder, but guilty of something more cowardly. Poirot turned back to the window, where the wind howled like an old god remembering something cruel. He whispered almost to himself, Footprints, Hastings, they are like secrets. Some we make, some we follow. But the most dangerous are those we plant, hoping no one will see where they lead. And with that, he left the prints behind him, unfollowed, untouched, and perfectly understood. Chapter 7. The letter he burned before reading. The flames danced too high for an ordinary fire. They curled around the paper like they knew its secret, and by the time anyone noticed the scent of scorched ink, the envelope had been consumed, unopened, unread. Only the wax seal remained, a charred red smear in the grate of the study fireplace. Sir Bennet Wycombe had thrown the letter into the flames with trembling hands. Less than an hour later, he was dead. When Hercule Poirot arrived at Windermere House that evening, the storm had already begun to creep across the moors. Rain tapped the window panes in deliberate patterns, like a warning in Morse. Poirot paused before entering the study where the body still lay, glancing once at the hearth. The fire was gone now, but the grate still glowed faintly, and beside it, in a dustpan barely concealed beneath the fender, were 3 half-burnt scraps, one bearing the unmistakable edge of a monogram, V.R. Ah, Poirot whispered. Even letters that go unread leave behind their shadows. Sir Bennet had been found slumped over his writing desk, a brandy glass spilled at his elbow, a single bullet hole behind his right ear. No sign of struggle, no defensive wounds. The gun had been wiped clean and left on the floor beside him. At first glance, it appeared to be suicide, neatly executed, even poetic. But the moment Poirot stepped into the room, he frowned. There is no powder burn, he said softly. The wound is too neat. The placement too precise. No, this was no act of despair. It was an execution masquerading as one. The household contained 6 people that evening, 3 guests, 3 servants, and a butler too old to lie convincingly. But only 3 stood out to Poirot as actors in the true drama behind Sir Bennet's death. First, Lydia Wycombe, the widow, not by law but by expectation. Tall, composed, and dressed not in mourning black, but in pale blue. She wept just enough to be respectable. Her voice broke once, at the word faithful, but Poirot watched her carefully place a handkerchief back in her pocket. Still dry. Bennet was under enormous stress, she said. That letter, he wouldn't tell me who sent it. He burned it before even opening it. You are certain? Poirot asked gently. I watched him do it, she replied. He said some things are better destroyed unread. A curious sentiment, madam, and one that rarely precedes a restful night. Next, Julian Ash, Sir Bennet's personal secretary, A wiry man with darting eyes and an accent he tried to flatten into gentility. He claimed to have been on the telephone at the time of the death, speaking with a solicitor in London. But no one could confirm the call. He was restless all afternoon, Julian said. Something was eating at him. He wasn't himself. Perhaps he was about to become himself, Poirot murmured. Just once. And then, Vincent Harrow, Sir Bennet's brother-in-law, a man with debts, lawsuits, and a reputation for just barely skimming beneath the law's blade. He had come, he claimed, to speak about a land dispute. I had nothing to gain from Bennet's death, he snapped when questioned. Which is not the same, Poirot replied mildly, as having nothing to lose. Act 1 ended with the discovery of the second letter. It had not been burned. It had not even been opened. It had been hidden carefully, beneath a false panel in Sir Bennet's drawer. Poirot found it while inspecting the legs of the desk. A trick hinge gave it away. The seal was broken, but the contents remained. A single page, typewritten. Your time is up. Either confess to what you did in 1897, or I will do it for you. The past has found you, Bennet, and it writes in fire. 1897, Poirot whispered, nearly 30 years ago. And yet, still loud enough to kill. Act 2 brought more smoke than fire. Red herrings came fast and thick. Lydia, it seemed, had once been engaged to Vincent Harrow before marrying Bennet. Julian Ash was not a certified secretary at all. He had forged his letters of recommendation, having once been accused of theft by a former employer. And Vincent, he had purchased a .38 revolver just 2 weeks earlier. The same caliber as the weapon found near the body. But the true clue was in the ashes. Poirot spent nearly an hour on the floor by the grate, brushing soot through a sieve. What he found was this: the corner of an envelope addressed not to Bennet, but to Lydia Wykeham. The letter had been meant for her, and yet it was Bennet who had burned it. That changed everything. Madame, Poirot said, confronting her in the blue parlor, you told me your husband burned a letter addressed to him, but in fact, he burned your letter. Why? She hesitated too long. Because he read the first line, she said finally, and I begged him to destroy it. Poirot nodded. So it was opened? Then why lie? She looked away. Because I wanted to believe it didn't exist. That whatever it said, it would vanish if I denied it aloud. But you knew what it meant, Poirot said. You knew what it would reveal. The final act began with the diary. Poirot found it hidden behind a bookcase in Bennet's private study. Inside, pages had been torn out, deliberately, methodically, but one remained. It contained a single name, Gideon Wren, a name long buried, Poirot's. Research was swift. Gideon Wren had been a clerk in a shipping office in 1897, accused of embezzlement, publicly shamed, fired, later found dead in the Thames, ruled a suicide. The accusation had come from one man, Bennet Wykeham. But what the court never knew, what the letter had revealed, was that the real thief had been Bennet himself. He had framed Gideon to save his own future. And Gideon Wren had not died that night. He had survived, disappeared, changed his name, and raised a daughter in secret, a daughter named Lydia. Poirot stood still as the final realization settled like ash. You knew, he said quietly. You knew the truth, and you married him anyway. Lydia stood by the window. Her hands were trembling now. He didn't recognize me, she said. Not at first. And then, when he did, he offered to change the will, give me everything, as if that could erase it. And the letter? Gideon wrote it before he died. He never posted it. I found it after, hidden in a box he left for me. It was addressed to Bennet. I had it delivered, but I didn't expect him to burn it unread. Poirot tilted his head. He read enough to understand what you were. And yet, Lydia whispered, he kissed me goodnight, poured my wine, said he would see me in the morning. Poirot nodded. Because guilt, madame, is not always followed by hatred. Sometimes it is followed by surrender. But I didn't kill him, she said. I swear. I thought, I thought the letter would destroy him. Not. Poirot held up a hand. I know. It was Julian Ashe who pulled the trigger. Bennett had confronted him after reading the letter meant for Lydia, had accused him of hiding other letters. And Julian, fearing exposure for his lies, his theft, and his role in tampering with Bennett's correspondence, had panicked. He waited until Bennett poured himself a drink, then entered through the study's back corridor, a silent shot, a clean exit. He wiped the gun and left it as a ruse. But he forgot one thing, the typewriter ribbon. Poirot showed the final evidence to the inspector. Julian typed the second letter himself, he said. The threats, the warning about 1897. He hoped to frighten Bennett, manipulate him. But when that failed, he killed him. Julian confessed under pressure. No theatrics, just quiet resignation. As he was led away, Lydia sat in silence by the fire. Poirot stood beside her, watching the flames. There is something tragic, madame, he said softly, in a man who dies believing he has paid the price, only to find his soul in debt still. She said nothing. Poirot looked at the grate, where ashes stirred faintly. The letter, he whispered, was never meant to be read. It was meant to be felt. And with that, he left her, alone with the fire, and the ghost that read every line. Chapter 8, The Gun That Never Fired. The scream came seconds after the clock struck 2, a sound that did not rise so much as it broke through the silence like shattered glass. Upstairs, the guests stirred in confusion. Slippers scuffed across carpet, and doors cracked open like blinking eyes. But by the time they reached the conservatory, it was too late. Lord Miles Harrington was dead, seated in his favorite armchair, one hand curled over the carved wooden armrest, the other dangling uselessly at his side. His head rested gently against the cushion, eyes open, mouth slightly parted. Beside him, as though staged for maximum drama, lay a revolver. Clean, unfired, loaded. When Hercule Poirot arrived at Weatherfield Hall not half an hour later, the body had not been moved. The rain had begun to fall with a steady rhythm, tapping the long glass panes of the conservatory like impatient fingers. Poirot stood just inside the threshold, umbrella still folded, coat damp, shoes pristine. He stared not at the body, but at the weapon. Ah, he said softly, so here it is. The star of tonight's performance, the gun that never fired. How obliging of it to pose so neatly, non? So visible, so theatrical. But guns, Hastings, are not actors. They do not play dead. Lord Harrington had been a man of power and polished cruelty, well known in his legal circles, feared among his family, and never loved for long by anyone who served beneath his roof. He was also dying, though only 3 people had known. Cancer, slow and painful. A diagnosis delivered 6 weeks ago, hidden even from his own daughter. But now he was dead not from disease, but from something far swifter. There was no blood, no wound, no sign of external force. And the gun beside him had not been fired. Poirot checked it himself. 5 bullets intact, 1 chamber empty, but not recently. There was no smell of gunpowder, no residue. The revolver had been loaded but never used. The doctor arrived shortly after. His report was ambiguous. No immediate cause of death could be determined without autopsy. Heart failure was possible, but not probable. And yet, no marks, no bruising, no poison detected in the tea he had been sipping. No evidence, save for the look in his eyes. A look of shock, betrayal, and something even colder. Realization. Poirot asked to speak with the household, and they assembled reluctantly in the drawing room. Each face watched him as if fearing they were next. Each expression held just enough restraint to mask what truly lay beneath. Lady Eleanor Harrington, the late lord's daughter, was composed and shivering. She wore a green velvet robe with pearls at her throat, as though determined to present dignity even in grief. She had been with her father earlier in the evening, reading from his favorite legal journals. She claimed to have retired at 10. He was unusually quiet. She said, but not sick, not more than usual. Poirot observed her hands. No rings, pale knuckles. A tremble not of fear, but of adrenaline. Next, Charles Wren, Harrington's business partner, a man in his 60s with sharp features and a voice like parchment scraping on wood. He had been Harrington's friend for over 30 years, or so he said. We disagreed over the will, Wren admitted. He intended to change it again. Said too many hands were outstretched. I told him it would only cause more chaos. Poirot tilted his head. And chaos, monsieur, is a great motivator for preemptive resolution, n'est-ce pas? Wren did not reply. And finally, Anna Rowley, the housekeeper. Middle-aged, soft-spoken, eyes downcast and nervous to speak in the presence of family. I was on the back staircase when I heard the scream, she said. Rushed down. Saw the gun first. Then, him. Poirot watched her carefully. And you touched nothing? Nothing, sir. Yet the gun had been moved, Poirot murmured. You see, madam, the dust along the armrest tells me it was placed after his hand fell, but not by him. Act 2 began with an inspection of the study. Poirot found a drawer locked, then picked with astonishing care. Inside, 2 envelopes, one sealed, one torn open. The open letter was from a lawyer, confirming an updated will had been written and sent by courier to be signed that night. The sealed letter, however, had no return address. It simply read, You don't get to die on your terms. You stole everything. Now watch it crumble. Poirot laid the letter flat against the desk. The paper was thick, expensive. The ink had bled slightly. The handwriting, elegant, controlled, but slanted. He ran a finger over the edge of the seal. It had been steamed open and resealed, poorly. Ah, he whispered, it is not only the truth that some people try to seal shut. It is the guilt, Osi. Next, he examined the Urano revolver. He turned it over delicately in gloved hands. No fingerprints. The bullets were clean, save for one, slightly tarnished. Poirot removed it with tweezers. It was coated not with dust or oil, but wax. Imitation, he said, or sabotage. He took it to the fireplace and held it close to the flame. The wax began to melt, and beneath it, a needle, hollow, barely noticeable, a modified cartridge. He turned back to the group. There was no bullet, he said, but there was a poison, delivered through air, inhaled as he lifted the gun to inspect it. Ingenious, quick, and theatrical. He paused. And so we must ask, who knew the man would hold the weapon? Who wanted him dead, but to appear to die by his own hand? The red herring came next. Anna Rowley, the housekeeper, had been dismissed from another estate 5 years prior after being accused, though never convicted, of poisoning a footman. The story had followed her. The press had hushed it, but Poirot found it. She confessed, trembling. It wasn't me, she cried. I served him faithfully. I swear it. Poirot believed her, but he needed the others to hear it first. Then came the first real twist. Lady Eleanor had received the sealed letter 2 days before her father's death. It had been sent to her, not to him. She had opened it, read it, and resealed it, then placed it among her father's papers. I didn't mean harm, she said. I wanted him to know someone, still hated him, to scare him. He hurt so many people. And you, Poirot asked, did he hurt you? She looked down. Only every time he looked at me and saw my mother. Poirot placed a hand gently on her shoulder. Truth, mademoiselle, is not the enemy of peace, only the delay of it. The final reveal arrived like thunder. Charles Wren had written the note, but he had not delivered the poison. Poirot assembled them once more in the conservatory. Lord Harrington, he said, was not a man who made enemies. He created them. He built them like monuments. He pointed to the revolver. This was modified by someone with skill, a chemist, a designer, not Anna, not Charles, and not Lady Eleanor. but someone whose past required such talents. Poirot held up a photograph, yellowed with time. It showed a younger Harrington in a court proceeding, and behind him, in the shadows of the crowd, a young man barely visible. His name, Poirot said, was Lucas Rowley, Anna's brother, a chemist, accused of manufacturing poison in 1911, sentenced by Lord Harrington. Poirot turned to Anna. You did not kill him, but your brother did. He disguised the poison as wax, delivered it to you as a gift. You placed the bullets into the gun thinking it was just empty, but your brother planned every step. Anna collapsed. I didn't know, she sobbed. He told me it would make him ill, that it would scare him. Poirot was silent. Scare, he whispered. That word again. But fear, madame, is never harmless when it is armed. He watched the rain streak the glass like tears. A gun that never fires, he said softly, can still kill Hastings. And sometimes the loudest weapon is the one that never speaks at all. And with that, he turned away. The gun lay quiet on the table, but its silence, like its secret, would echo for years. Chapter 9. A witness who couldn't speak. The bird wouldn't stop screaming, a high-pitched, shrill repetition that echoed down the tiled corridor of Grangeford House like a siren in a forgotten asylum. At first they thought it was just the parrot, Lady Araminta's old African gray, locked in its gilded cage near the landing. But when the housekeeper came to cover it for the night, she saw something far worse through the parlor doorway. The scream wasn't from the bird. It was what the bird had seen. Sir Malcolm Barrington was dead, slumped in his armchair beneath the portrait of his first wife, his pipe overturned, ash spilled like gray snow across the Persian rug. His eyes were open, fixed on something, or someone, who was no longer in the room. But the bird had seen, and now it would not stop repeating a single phrase. Don't touch that. Poirot arrived just before midnight. Rain scattered across his polished shoes like drum beats as he stood at the parlor. Threshold, umbrella folded, gaze unblinking. The room was oddly still. The fire had long gone out, and on the hearth next to the fallen poker lay a handkerchief with a delicate embroidered G. Poirot bent down slowly. He did not pick it up. He did not need to. He only stared at it for a long, quiet moment. Ah, he said softly, the witness who cannot speak, but repeats what he was not meant to hear. Mon Dieu, such witnesses are more dangerous than most. Sir Malcolm had not been well liked. He had outlived 3 wives, alienated 2 sons, and squandered his family's respectability for land speculation and bad debts. He was a man who controlled everything, his money, his daughters, his narrative, and now he was gone. No blood, no wound, no sign of struggle, and yet he had died with his mouth open, fingers twisted, and a strange discoloration on his lips. Poirot touched the teacup on the side table. Still warm, still fragrant, lavender and something else, bitter, earthy. Not poison perhaps, but a numbing agent, a sedative. The coroner had not yet arrived, but Poirot did not need the man's report to know what he already suspected. Sir Malcolm had been poisoned, and the scene had been staged to suggest otherwise. Too neat, too convenient. And then there was the parrot, repeating not a word but a warning. The household was already tense when Poirot summoned them to the drawing room. 3 stood apart, each flanked by shadows and secrets. First, Julia Barrington, the youngest daughter, sharp, independent, recently returned from Florence where she had studied architecture. He was going to disinherit me, she said coolly. He thought I was too modern, too selfish, too loud, but I still loved him. In my way. Poirot smiled faintly. Ah, mademoiselle. Love is a curious inheritance. One can lose it long before a will is written. Second, Thomas Lee, the family solicitor. Middle-aged, balding, perpetually damp with anxiety. He had drafted Sir Malcolm's final will 3 days earlier, but confessed the document had not yet been signed. He said he needed more time, Lee stammered. He wasn't sure anymore. There were complications. Complications, Poirot repeated. Is that not always the word men use when guilt becomes inconvenient? Third, Lillian Everstone, the companion, hired 6 months ago to attend to Sir Malcolm's declining health. Beautiful, soft-spoken, widowed. She had arrived with excellent references and a veil of discretion so thick even Poirot couldn't see through it on first glance. I made him tea, she admitted, as I always did. He complained of headache. I left him there after he fell asleep. Poirot examined her carefully. She did not blink too much, but her nails were chipped, bitten recently, nervously. A habit resurfaced. Tell me, he asked, why do you tremble now, madam, when you did not tremble? Before? She said nothing. That night, Poirot walked the hallways in silence. The storm had settled into a quiet drizzle. He paused outside the birdcage where the parrot had finally gone still, its head tucked beneath its wing. Poirot reached into his pocket and drew out a sugar cube. He placed it on the stand, whispering, "Even a silent witness has a price." Then he turned to the desk. The drawer was locked, but the lock was old. Poirot opened it with a thin blade. Inside, he found a sealed envelope labeled, "To be opened upon my death." It was addressed to Thomas Lee, but the seal had already been broken. Inside was a letter, a confession, and it wasn't from Sir Malcolm. It was from Lillian Everstone, written 3 months ago, folded and refolded until the edges had gone soft. It read, "I cannot bear it anymore. He knows. He watches me. He taunts me with silence. If I disappear, you must know it was not illness that took me, but she had not disappeared. She had stayed, and Sir Malcolm had died." Poirot returned to the drawing room at dawn. He examined the teacup again, then the fireplace, and there, behind a stack of kindling, he found the missing bottle. A small glass vial, empty. Its label read Belladonna extract, to be diluted. The twist came not in the vial, but in the handwriting on the label. It was not Lillian's, nor Julia's, but Thomas Lee's, a match to the annotations in Sir Malcolm's legal files. The solicitor had prescribed the extract himself. Poirot summoned them again. "Sir Malcolm Barrington did not die of natural causes," he began. "He was poisoned, carefully, gradually over weeks. A dosage too small to be detected in a single cup, but accumulated, it silenced the heart." He turned to Lee. "You administered the extract, masked as a therapeutic suggestion. You advised Lillian to deliver it. You watched as she did, knowing she would one day be blamed." Lee stuttered, furious. "That's absurd. I only followed instructions. He trusted me." "Non, monsieur. He feared you, because you held the secrets of his past. The embezzlement, the land fraud, the illegal trusts." Poirot turned to Lillian. "You suspected something, and you wrote a letter, but you never sent it, because Lee found it, and used it to manipulate you further." Lillian covered her face. "I thought I'd killed him. I thought I'd helped." Poirot shook his head. "No, madam. You brewed the tea, but it was he who filled the vial. The man who benefited from the unsigned will, who stood to lose everything if it had been completed." Then he turned to Julia. "And you, mademoiselle, you knew. You saw Lee switch the vials. You confronted him, but he threatened to expose your debts, your affair. You kept silent." Julia's voice cracked. "He said if I spoke, I'd lose what little I had left. And in doing so," Poirot said, gently, "you lost your father's final truth." The inspector made the arrest in silence. As Lee was led away, the parrot suddenly stirred. "Don't touch that," it squawked. Poirot smiled faintly. "Indeed," he murmured, "one should never touch what one cannot carry." He turned to the window. Dawn had come, but the storm still lived in the corners of the house, in the rooms, in the silence of a bird who had seen everything, remembered everything, and waited patiently to be heard. Emmerich chapter 10. The dinner guest who lied about dessert. The spoon rested on the saucer, untouched. Not even a smear of custard had clung to its silver edge. The plate was perfectly clean, too clean, and yet the guest who had supposedly devoured the lemon tart had smiled wide and exclaimed, "Exquisite, my dear!" Light as air. The compliment, like the guest himself, had arrived late and landed too neatly. An hour later, the host collapsed on the staircase, clutching his chest, eyes wide with something deeper than pain. Recognition. The storm outside held its breath as Poirot stepped into Greystone Manor. Rain slicked the stones like lacquered skin, and thunder echoed like slow applause. Inside, servants whispered in corners, and the drawing room reeked of spiced wine and alarm. The table was still set, as if the meal had never ended. Candles flickered atop polished silver, their flames quivering like the lies still hanging in the air. And at the far end of the table, beneath the portrait of Lord Giles Ainsworth, his body lay crumpled on the floor beside a shattered brandy glass. "Forgive me," Poirot said softly, adjusting his cuffs, "but I believe dessert has been most informative." Lord Ainsworth had died minutes after rising to thank his guests. The meal, a formal gathering of 6, had concluded with polite laughter and a clink of cutlery. He had stepped away to fetch an old letter he wished to share, then never returned. He was found halfway up, staircase, dead from what the initial physician called a sudden cardiac event. But Poirot had already seen the truth, not in the heart, but in the mouth. A faint yellow tint along the tongue's edge. Citrusy, bitter, and very much deliberate. Poirot's first question, naturally, was about dessert. "Who prepared the lemon tart?" he asked the kitchen maid. She pointed to the cook, Mrs. Delamore, a stern, red-faced woman who had served the Ainsworth family for 28 years. "Same recipe as always," she insisted. "No changes. Nothing strange. I tasted it myself." "And yet," Poirot replied, "one guest remarked on it. Said it was light as air. Curious, because I examined the tart and I found it dense, heavy, almost underbaked. Not the sort to earn praise unless one was not paying attention at all." 3 guests stood out immediately. First, Beatrice Ainsworth, the young widow, though not of Giles but of his late cousin. Elegant, clever, a pianist of moderate fame, she had returned to Greystone only recently, claiming to reconnect with the past. She had been seated to Giles' right during dinner and had poured his wine herself. "He was kind to me," she said, "but cruel to others, especially his sister." Poirot arched a brow. "And you, madame? Did you find his kindness sufficient?" Second, Roger Pembroke, a historian and former university friend of Giles's. He wore a bow tie too large for his neck and a nervous smile that twitched when questioned. "We hadn't spoken in years," he admitted. "He invited me out of the blue. I thought perhaps he was making amends." "Ah," Poirot said gently. "And did he succeed, monsieur?" Before his untimely demise. Third, Madeleine Cray, the governess. Young, quiet, recently hired. She had no clear ties to the family before arriving, but Poirot noted how she avoided Beatrice's gaze and how her hands, so still at dinner, now trembled with every question. "I was in the corridor when he collapsed," and she said, "I didn't see what happened." "But you heard?" Poirot asked. "Yes." "What exactly?" She hesitated. "He said a name, I think, but I didn't recognize it." Poirot leaned closer. "Say it, mademoiselle." She looked down. "He said, Julian." The name cracked something in the room. Julian Ainsworth had been Giles's younger brother. Dead 10 years. Officially ruled an accidental drowning. But the file Poirot requested from Scotland Yard had been unusually thin. No witness statements, no autopsy, no photographs. Just a signed confession from Giles stating Julian had taken his own life, out of shame, guilt, weakness. Poirot walked the house in silence that evening, noting details others ignored. The polished stair rail had one sticky spot, lemon, faintly sweet. The study window had been opened during the storm despite the rain. On Giles's desk, a set of letters bound in green ribbon. The seal broken. The last. Letter was unsigned, but Poirot recognized the script immediately. It belonged to Julian. "Ah," he murmured, "so the ghost has returned. Not to haunt, but to accuse." Act 2 unfolded in layers. Beatrice had discovered the letters days ago while rummaging through the attic archives. She claimed to have shown them to Giles, who became enraged. "He burned the ones with Julian's handwriting," she said, "but I kept copies." Roger Pembroke, it seemed, had been more than a friend. He and Julian had been lovers, something Giles had once hinted at, cruelly, in a university letter. "He wanted it buried," Roger said, his voice tight. "All of it. He told Julian he'd ruin him." Julian vanished soon after. And Madeline, she was Julian's daughter, born in secret, raised in France, sent to Greystone by a benefactor who called himself Mr. D. She had only learned the truth months ago. "I didn't come for revenge," she said. "I just wanted to know why." Poirot nodded. "The past, mademoiselle, is like an echo. It always returns. The question is whether we face it or pretend it was silence." Act 3 began with a lie. A small one, a sweet one. Roger Pembroke had not eaten his dessert. Poirot confronted him quietly in the morning room, where the sun failed to warm anything but the curtains. "You praised the lemon tart," Poirot said. Yes, but you didn't eat it." Roger hesitated. "I wasn't hungry, but you described it as light as air." He swallowed. "I thought it would be polite." "Non," Poirot said. "You lied. Not to flatter, but to distance yourself. The tart, it turned out, had been poisoned. A rare extract from Aconitum ferox, bitter, odorless when baked, lethal in small doses, particularly when taken with alcohol. The poison had been hidden not in the custard, but in the crust, mixed into the butter, where the taste would be dulled. Only one tart had been affected, the one served to Giles. Poirot gathered them all in the parlor just before dusk. "Lord Giles Ainsworth," he said, "was murdered. Not by chance, not by rage, but by someone who needed his silence to remain absolute." He turned to Roger. "You knew he was rewriting the will. You knew Madeline was his heir." Roger's face paled. "I wanted justice," he said. "For Julian. For what was stolen." Poirot nodded. "But you could not act alone." He turned to Beatrice. "You baked the tart." Her hand went to her throat. "He told me he pushed Julian," she whispered. "Said he deserved it, that he laughed while watching him drown." "And Madeline?" Poirot asked. "She didn't know," Beatrice said. "I swear it." Poirot was silent. Then he walked to the table and picked up the silver dessert spoon. "Do you see, Hastings?" he murmured. "Sometimes the smallest utensil holds the sharpest truth. A man praised a dessert he never ate. And so I ask, who placed that spoon beside his plate?" No one answered. The truth was already served. As the inspector arrived, Poirot turned once more to the guests. "The dead," he said quietly, "do not always cry for vengeance. Sometimes they only ask that we remember, that we speak the name no one else will." He walked out into the storm. Behind him, the tart sat untouched. Sweet, beautiful, and deadly. A lie served cold, and finally understood. Surely, Chapter 11. He knew the killer's name, but died laughing. The sound echoed off the marble walls. A laugh, strange and sudden, broken halfway through by a violent choke. It was not the kind of laughter born of amusement, but of something sharper, stranger. A final act of defiance that chilled everyone seated at the long mahogany table. By the time they reached Professor Alaric Denham's chair, the laugh had stopped, and so had his breath. His lips still curled upward. His fingers gripped the edge of the table, and in his left hand, scribbled in trembling strokes across the linen napkin, was one word. "Ha ha." Poirot stood silently over the body, arms folded, gaze still as a painting. Around them, the room remained immaculate, candles flickering low, the scent of roast duck still warm in the air, a string quartet playing somewhere in the distance before being hastily silenced. The wine glasses had not been cleared. The dessert cart stood untouched near the velvet drapes, but the laughter, yes, that remained, echoing within every guest's expression. They had all heard it, a laughter that knew something no one else yet did. Ah, Poirot murmured, kneeling beside the corpse. How very curious. The final act of a man whose intellect outweighed his fear. To laugh at death, Hastings, is not courage, it is revelation. Professor Denham had been a brilliant, if difficult, mind. Mathematician, philosopher, and moral theorist. The sort of man who dismantled others with words more swiftly than any weapon. He had hosted the dinner at Halbert House for his own retirement celebration, inviting 6 guests, 3 friends, 2 adversaries, and 1 stranger. He had toasted them all with champagne. Then 20 minutes later, he laughed, clutched his chest, and died. Poirot began, as always, with the contradictions. There was no visible sign of trauma, no sign of poison in the wineglass. Poirot had tasted it himself. And yet Denham's pupils were dilated, his pulse had stopped instantly, and a faint residue, a metallic scent, lingered on his fingertips. Poirot leaned in close. Not arsenic, not cyanide. Something newer, cleaner, untraceable to the untrained eye. The guests, though shaken, remained. Their stories diverged quickly. Madeline Ross, Denham's former protégée, had argued with him earlier that evening. She was a neuroscientist with ambition far surpassing charm, and her eyes were too dry for someone so recently in the presence of death. We disagreed professionally, she said. He said I was too eager to publish without ethics. I said he was stuck in the last century. Poirot tilted his head. And in your final conversation, mademoiselle, did you threaten him? I told him he'd regret stalling my research, she said. But not like this. Next, Marcus Llewellyn, Denham's publisher and closest social confidant. He was fidgeting with his cufflinks when Poirot approached. Alaric had enemies, he said quickly. God knows how many people he insulted this year alone. He lived on controversy. Ah, Poirot replied, and controversy, monsieur, makes a convenient disguise for revenge. The third, Lydia Crane, Denham's housekeeper of 20 years. She had served the wine, cleared the plates, and remained invisible as most servants are trained to do. But Poirot noticed how her eyes flicked every time someone mentioned the toast, how she clutched the edge of her apron, as if it steadied her breath. He said things, she whispered, that last week. Things I'd never heard him say before. He said someone from his past was coming. Did he say who? No, but he said if he could name them, they'd lose everything. That night, Poirot walked the dining room alone. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the scent of pine and cloves clung to the tablecloth. He examined Denham's chair, then the wine decanter. A tiny etching beneath the handle caught his eye, faint, almost invisible. A mark, a number, a lab code. Poirot's brow furrowed. He returned to the linen napkin, the one Denham had scrawled on in his final moment. Ha, not a laugh. A name? Poirot scanned the guest list again. Harlan Stone, the guest from the university board. Quiet, bookish, unassuming. He had barely spoken during dinner, yet watched everyone with the quiet efficiency of a man gathering data. When confronted, Harlan stiffened. I was never close. To Denham, he said. He humiliated my father in a debate once. But I respected him. Respect, Poirot said, is often the mask worn by the wounded. Then came the first twist. Denham had called the local paper 2 days before his death. He had requested a journalist attend the dinner, not to report, to observe. A Mr. Nathaniel Reed, a political columnist, was seated at the far end of the table that night. No one questioned it because Denham was known for such eccentricities. But Reed had not brought a notepad. He had brought a hidden recorder. Poirot listened to the tape in the study. The audio was muffled at first, clinking glasses, forks. Then Denham's voice rising slightly above the others. You know why I brought you all here, he said. Because one of you tried to destroy me, and I know who it was. Laughter followed, nervous, confused. Then Denham again. I have your name, and I've written it where only a man who understands the game can find it. That was when the tape cut. Poirot turned it off. Ah, he murmured. Then the laughter was not madness. It was victory. He knew, and he made certain the killer would hear that laugh before death came. The red herring came swiftly. Madeline Ross was arrested. Her research lab had a contract with a pharmaceutical firm, the same firm that produced the rare neurotoxin found in Denham's bloodstream. She had access, motive, and a public feud. Even the inspector believed it closed, but Poirot did not. It was too neat, too precise. The poison, he believed, had not been administered through the wine, nor the food, but through contact. The metal napkin ring, the one placed only at Denham's seat, had been coated, slowly absorbed through the skin. That ring had been polished last, by the housekeeper. Poirot returned to Lydia Crane. She wept when he confronted her. I didn't kill him, she said, but I know who did. I helped him. Place the name who? She hesitated, then whispered, he told me if anything happened, I was to go to the chessboard. Poirot stood silently. The chessboard in the library was laid out mid-game. Denham had always played alone, reliving historic matches. One move had been made since the night before. Knight to f6, a coded reference. Poirot opened the chessboard drawer. Inside a single envelope, sealed, addressed to Hercule Poirot. He opened it with gloved fingers. Inside was a single note. He thinks he won, but his real checkmate was 10 years ago. Tell Harlan I forgave him. I died laughing, not in cruelty, but because I knew it would eat him alive. Poirot summoned the guests. Harlan Stone, he said, you poisoned Professor Denham, not because of his past offense, but because of your fear that he had not forgotten it. Harlan did not deny it. He only asked, how did he know? Poirot smiled sadly. He understood human nature, monsieur. And he remembered what you wore the night your father lost. Silver cufflinks with the crest of your old academy. You wore them tonight, the same night he chose to die. Harlan was arrested, but the room remained heavy, not with guilt, but with the weight of the unspoken. Poirot stood by the window gazing into the dark. He laughed, he said softly, because death is only tragic to those who fear it. But to the man who names his killer and forgives him, it becomes the final move in a long, bitter game. And in the silence, Poirot smiled. Not because the case was solved, but because the man who died had already won. Chapter 12. Poirot's last word wasn't his. The final page of the manuscript was missing. Torn from the leather-bound journal with such precision it could have been done with a surgeon's blade. The bloodstain across the open book, however, was not precise. It had splattered at an angle, suggesting the writer had been seated, head bowed, when the blow came. Or as Hercule Poirot now suspected, he had fallen forward only after the deception was complete. The hand that held the pen last had been steady, too steady, and the signature at the bottom of the second-to-last page, Poirot, had not been written by him. Poirot stood alone in the study of Chateau du Marais, his reflection a pale blur in the dust-tinted window. The candle beside him flickered violently as if recoiling from what the air remembered. Outside, the wind scoured the hillside vineyards. Inside, the fire had gone cold in the hearth, and in the shadows of the library, someone had written his death, before it happened. Or rather, had written as him in a voice that did not belong. He had come here on invitation. A simple letter, unsigned, postmarked Geneva. An old mystery, it claimed, one that had never reached the papers, one that only he could solve. The house, rented by a reclusive British nobleman for the season, was quiet upon arrival, yet every corner breathed surveillance. Poirot had sensed it the moment his foot crossed the threshold. The furniture was arranged too, neatly. The piano had dust on the keys, except for 3. A chess set was mid-game, with a sequence that ended not in checkmate, but in deliberate stalemate, and upon the mantel, a photograph of a man who did not exist in any archive. Poirot, ever exact, had found the contradiction intolerable. But he did not expect murder. Not his own. The body was found 2 hours after Poirot had supposedly retired to his room. Slumped across the study desk, dressed in one of Poirot's tailored suits and with a bullet through the left temple, the face had been disfigured. The wallet contained Poirot's papers. The room bore no signs of forced entry, but the manuscript, the confession, the closing account of a final, impossible case, was written as if Poirot had known this moment was coming. Its tone was wrong, its rhythm unconvincing, and yet the signature remained. Ah, Poirot whispered to himself now, even the dead may lie, but only the living can impersonate truth. So well, 3 guests remained at the chateau, each with ties to a case long thought buried. Sebastian Greaves, former intelligence operative turned novelist, was the one who had found the body. He had worked with Poirot during the Holland espionage trial of 1926, a time both had agreed never to revisit. His demeanor remained calm, but his eyes scanned too quickly, as if always estimating danger. I saw the silhouette from the hallway, Greaves explained. I thought he was writing, but when I stepped closer, I saw the blood. I didn't touch anything. Poirot watched him carefully. But you read the final page, n'est-ce pas? Greaves hesitated. It was already missing. Next was Celeste Montfort, the Italian pianist whose mother had once been accused of murder in a case Poirot had famously declined to investigate. Because it was too neat, he had said at the time. Now, years later, Celeste stood pale and composed, her eyes damp with something Poirot could not yet name. I came to confront you, she said. That's the truth. You let my mother rot in shame. You had the power to clear her name, but you walked away. I had reason to doubt the innocence of all parties involved, Poirot replied, even the ones who cried the loudest. She didn't deny it. And now you're the one on trial, aren't you? Last was Dr. Hugo Weiss, a former psychiatrist who had been publicly disgraced after one of his patients, a former Poirot suspect, confessed to a string of murders under his care. Weiss had defended his patient's dissociative fugues at the time. Poirot had described them more succinctly, an elaborate fiction built by a guilty mind. Weiss smiled when asked about the manuscript. Genius is fragile, he said. I've studied you for years, Monsieur Poirot. The obsessiveness, the rituals, the solitude. You always wanted control. Even in death, you couldn't let go. But perhaps someone else decided to help you exit on your terms. Poirot didn't blink. You are too quick with your diagnosis, doctor. That is the luxury of a man who no longer holds a license to do harm. As Act 2 unfolded, the inconsistencies multiplied. The bullet was fired from Poirot's own revolver, kept locked in a case he never opened. But the safe had no signs of forced entry. Only someone who knew the code, or had watched closely, could have opened it. A clock had been stopped deliberately at 10:47 p.m., but the time of death was estimated at least an hour earlier. The photograph on the mantel was not of a stranger. It was a retouched image of Poirot from his youth, altered at the temples and jawline. And then there was the chest set. It had been moved. Poirot had traced the fingerprints. His own on the Black Knight, Greaves's on the White Bishop, Weiss's on the pawn, twice moved. But Celeste? No fingerprints. And yet she had spoken about the game as if she'd studied its position. You mentioned the board, Poirot said. And yet you claim you never touched it? She nodded. I saw it from the doorway. Poirot said nothing, but the cut on her right index finger, the kind left by a sharpened rook, said otherwise. Then came the red herring, a second journal, locked in the guest suite, found in Weiss's luggage, filled with pages written in mirrored French. An analysis revealed it was not his handwriting, but the confession within, dated days before the murder, outlined a plan to expose Poirot's legacy as a lie. The narrative suggested Poirot had framed multiple suspects across the decades, that he had misused evidence, even fabricated logic. It's fiction, Weiss said. Someone planted it. And yet, Poirot said, it reads like someone who has studied my thoughts very well. He returned to the study alone. Rain struck the windows like fingernails. He examined the chair again. Beneath the cushion, a wire, a recorder. It had been running for days. Poirot played the tape. He heard himself, speaking, dictating thoughts, describing suspects, cases. Then a pause, then a voice not his. The imposter mimicked his accent, his cadence, almost perfectly. And then, at the very end, the world will remember this as Poirot's final word. But of course, it isn't his. Poirot froze. He had been expected to find this. Act 3 came like a shadow behind the door. He summoned them all. This was no ordinary murder, Poirot said. It was an assassination of identity. The killer did not want to end a life. They wanted to rewrite a legacy. He looked at Celeste. You despised me for what I did not do, and so you used what I value most, my precision, my voice, my truth against me. Celeste shook her head. You think I could have pulled this off alone? Poirot nodded. You did not. You were the distraction. Greaves was the executioner. And Weiss, the chronicler. Poirot pointed to the manuscript. This was not written by one hand. It was a collaboration, a fiction designed to replace me. And when the body was found, it was not meant to be me. It was meant to convince the world that I had chosen to die. Greaves stepped forward. We wanted justice. You wanted revenge, Poirot said. But you failed. Because the last word, ha, was not a signature. It was a crack, a flaw in the illusion. A note from a man who died laughing, not because he triumphed, but because he realized. He had been used. He turned to the inspector, now standing silent at the door. I have recorded this confession, Poirot said. I request it be sealed and published posthumously, not because I fear death, but because I respect truth. And truth, like the little gray cells, must be tended to until the very end. The arrest followed, and Poirot stood once more in the study, alone. He touched the chessboard, reset the pieces, and whispered, the last word is not always ours. But silence that follows, that must still be honest. Then he turned out the light, and the room went still.